Greetings, System Failure listeners. Nate here, and Brian over there, coming to you with podcast number 101 today. Brian, how are you faring this week?
Pretty good. You're bringing a lot of energy for a Tuesday afternoon.
Yeah, we are spinning early again this week due to weekend commitments. And just to let all of our fine System Failure listeners know, you are a year older than when we last spun, last week.
I mean, really, I'm like a week older, but yes, under some kind of measurement, I am now 37, where I was once 36.
The clock has ticked over on you. Yeah. Well, that's interesting. We did have a chance to get together with our family for a barbecue. I guess you would call it a barbecue, right?
I mean, it was barbecued food.
Yeah. Jason made our middle brother, who a one-time guest on this very podcast, made the brisket, and everyone else potlucked it. So, I mean, I guess you're right. You would call it a barbecue, even if it wasn't traditional barbecue fare. But
I mean, we weren't sitting around a fire pit with meats cooking on it, but the meats had already been cooked.
Yes.
But yeah, we had some brisket. It's the king of meats. I guess one thing I'd say about it is that chicken is like a low-key, like underrated smoked meat. Like the bone-in chicken, those thighs and drumsticks are off the chain when in smoky goodness, you know?
Yeah. Well, I guess when you get the smoker, you want to go for the deluxe meat and get something really fancy. But you're right. You can't go wrong with the tried and true smoked chicken off the chain.
Yes, sir.
And how was it interacting with our family? Did you like enjoy your birthday celebration overall?
It was pretty chill.
Do you like being the center of attention? I always hate it when it's my birthday and it's like I'm down to get together, but everyone wants to wish you a happy birthday and reminisce about your life. And I'm just happy to see everyone. We don't have to do it every time, but people are people.
Maybe it's a little uncomfortable. Like, we have to kind of like rehash the same familial stories each time. That's the tradition. And once you get to be 37. Done it many times.
And everyone loves being in a situation where we can rehash the things they did when they were barely sentient and like 5 and 6 years old. That's always awesome. They like being stapled to your to your 5-year-old self or whatever misdeed you did at that age.
Well, I guess Jason and Grace's baby commanded most of the attention, so I guess I got off relatively easily.
And their baby's about 6 months old and rounding into true chubby baby form. We hadn't seen her for a month or two. She was very infantile. Back then, but now she can look around and make facial expressions, a lot more entertaining this time through, eh?
She can hold up her head a little bit.
That's it. Yeah, she's got those neck muscles. Before it was kind of just kind of floppy. You just had to be really careful with her. But that's pretty good. So you're a year older and wiser, eh?
Hopefully.
All right. Well, happy belated birthday from me and all of the System Failure listeners. Well, Brian, I wonder if you have noticed all of the news about these under 18 laws popping up, the over 18 laws, like the identification, verification. Spotify's doing one. Some of the game companies are doing one. The UK is doing one. Across the board for like all their social media. A little unclear on what they're doing over at the UK. And then a bunch of US states have got their porn sites on lockdown, so you've got to upload a picture of your license in order to look at their it really seems it's really odd how this thing is being rolled out globally. It reminds me of like the Build Back Better and the 2 weeks to whatever the COVID slogans were. They were always coordinated at the highest global level, at a level, over and above our individual sovereign governments. So is this something you've noticed, Brian? The headlines are rolling in one after another. Someone behind the scenes really wants us uploading all of our ID into the internet.
The last thing that I noticed would have to be like the real ID. When I was traveling out to Los Angeles is like now a thing. Of course, that was being heralded for a while.
Yeah,
but I don't really know how, because it seems like you have the same driver's license. But I guess the real ID lets them track the shit out of you somehow.
Yeah. Real ID it's been in the offing for like a decade, maybe even more. They keep punting on they kept punting on the deadline until finally we couldn't punt anymore. That feels like a separate batch in this recent summer 2025 push to age gate everything and just overall increase the load of the layer of surveillance over the internet. That's very interesting.
Well, I think having age verification for going on the P-Hub probably a good thing on the whole, eh?
I would agree that porn is a deleterious effect, same as like cigarettes, right? But except for I wouldn't want to have to I don't want to be identified and tracked with every purchase. That seems sinister to me. So while I'll agree, I don't think that this kind of law is going to prevent anyone from watching a single second of pornography if they want to. You can easily download a VPN and get around it. It's elementary to avoid these things, right? So it's not as if anyone's children, I don't think anyone's going to be really deterred, from hitting up the old P-Hub and checking out those big booty, back shots.
All right. Well, to your point, yeah, certainly like social credit scores are coming and all that good stuff and constant government tracking. I'm sure you'll get issued, government issued currency that only works, if you haven't started any podcasts recently talking about the financial system and whatnot.
Yes. So we don't want people to be able to get resources for themselves if they've got heretical opinions.
Yeah, Mark. If you've talked about Marxism, I'm sure
that's
screwed.
the end of the line. Yeah, your money's getting shut off.
Yeah, but on the other hand, just like age verification for the P-Hub and social media websites. At least there's some kind of positive in that. But I guess I've vaguely seen about this stuff, although I haven't really been following it. And so yeah. Anyway, I'm sure the social credit score is upon us. Will be upon us soon.
It is the if you get these stodgy legislators from Tennessee and Texas who want to introduce this kind of legislation. You know what? It kind of sucks for the residents of whatever district now has the ID pop-up window. But it is the coordination. It is the fact that this is going on in so many polities worldwide simultaneously. It gives me the chills. It's like, whatever the thing is. Whatever it is that controls us, above our, I always say, nominal heads of state. Whatever it is that's really ruling us, above the Westphalian nation states. That thing seems to think that it's time for some real tracking, a much more robust tracking system on the internet. So I'm wondering, that means it makes me think of our old friend Catherine Fitz, the assistant director of housing and urban development under George H.W. Bush, who was on the Tucker podcast months and months ago, and she's talked, of course, about those building these parallel systems to migrate us all into once our current system inevitably collapses. So I don't know. It feels like that to me, and it harkens back to the COVID era with all of that disturbing international communication, international collusion on how to control populations. It was chilly.
Well, I for one can't wait yet to have to register my ID to voice any dissent online, when the next pandemic happens. And if you have an opinion about how you have to wear your mask on the plane, but then you can take it off to eat on the plane.
Yeah, when the Fiesta Mix comes around, the masks come down.
Yes. So if you have some kind of opinion about that, you'll have to register. I'd like to register my support for this idea and renounce any associations with Marxism that I may have had in the past.
Get out ahead of it, eh?
Yes.
So this is another thought I was having this week. I've jotted down some random thoughts here, but I just remember, you may recall last summer we had Dr. Michael Hudson on the pod, and I was asking him about the history of anti-Semitism during the Middle Ages, and is that related to the banking activities? And he just cut me off. We don't want to talk about that anti-Semitic crap, was almost his exact quote. Anti-Semitic crap was definitely in the sentence. And that just reminds me so much of walking to TD Garden to see Roger in 2011 or whenever it was, that they had that big lit up billboard truck denouncing Roger's an anti-Semite. It's like if your bomber's taking flack, well, you can be assured that you're reasonably close to the target. So I was just smiling and reminiscing and noticing to myself this week that if you ask too many questions about international finance or compound interest, right? I'm a guy with $50K in student loan debt. It's like you're going to ask some questions about the history of compound interest, and so you can get hit with the anti-Semitism. The same way that anti-Semitism is used to dispense with any criticism of the Israeli government, it's also used to keep people from asking too many questions about compound interest or the role of international finance and the distribution of political power around the world. Things like that. Things that have nothing whatsoever to do with anyone's religion, ethnicity, or creed, right? We are just purely talking about political power structures here and economic power structures here. But it's interesting that you get slapped, with the... poor Roger, the anti-Semitism label for, criticizing the Israeli government or asking too many questions about the shadowy world of international finance. Now, to be fair, it wasn't like Hudson was saying I was an anti-Semite. It's just that, you could just tell that poor man who himself is an expert on the history of finance going back thousands of years, you can just tell that he mentioned something to me about this to me afterwards in an email, just saying, yeah, I mean, he's just had trouble getting his ideas published because of this problem of being called the accusation of anti-Semitism. You could just tell he had come up against it. So whereas I have not really been accused of being an anti-Semite for questioning, compound interest, you can tell that it happened to Dr. Hudson, like you can just tell his sensitivity on the matter. And so I'm making a lot of assumptions there, but it's just interesting that you get the same flack when you fly your bomber over what is Israel doing in Gaza may not be 100% above board, and hey, what the banks are doing may not be 100% above board. You get the same flack comes for your bomber. You see, I just think that's really interesting.
Well, that was the one question that wasn't on the list that you had already sent to Dr. Michael
I gave
Hudson.
him the list of free questions, and but I dropped that one on him. Otherwise, I'm sure he would have had a better answer. You can tell that he hadn't heard the question before based on the quality of the reply. So I did not do him a favor by springing one on him. That is for sure. Excuse me. But if I hadn't asked the question, we wouldn't have got that flack, that immune response, the flack over the target. So I don't know. All in all, it's a fascinating subject.
Well, you can see how there'd be, a study of banking history and anti-Semitism, or well, some people are going to be investigating this because, I don't know, they're like neo-Nazis or something, rather than trying to get to the bottom of the matter. Well,
that's the idea, right? That's the idea that's put out there. I've never really listened to any neo-Nazis. I got no idea. Do you think they have criticisms? I totally recognize what you're saying. Like, I suspect that you might be able to find people who actually are anti-Semitic using the banking system to criticize their hatred or whatever. I've never heard it though.
Well,
and maybe I don't know enough. I've never really absorbed neo-Nazi or whatever it is material.
It's one of these things where there's people on the internet who do this anyway. Like, I mean, there's furries on the internet, and I haven't met any in real life, but they're on the internet.
Well, that's who I'm talking about. Have you ever seen? I've definitely seen crazy anti-Semitism on the internet, but I've never seen the banking canard as part of it. It may just be that I'm not looking in the right places. I'm no way pretending that trying to be comprehensive here. I feel like I've seen white supremacist stuff. I've seen anti-Semitism stuff. Never really seen it tied into banking, and that really may just be the fact, just because I don't hang out in places that have those sorts of things very often. So I don't really know.
Well, I guess I just fathom broadly that, I don't know, there's a connection between Judaism and banking, for better or for worse, and it becomes the basis of like some kind of stereotypes or assumptions or something.
When I asked Hudson the question, I was thinking specifically about Graeber's book, in which he details the horrors visited upon several members of several of King John's Jewish subjects, the specific tortures, like pulling out molars and pulling off skin, to try to get their debts forgiven. So after Hudson reprimanded me for bringing it up, I went back and read that chapter. I'm like, well, I thought I was on firm ground here. And then hilariously, in the next paragraph, Graeber writes, we mustn't let any of this make us think that Jews did the majority of the banking in the Middle Ages. Mostly it was the Saracens, and Hudson had one other example too. But it was interesting to see that Hudson had the exact same, the thing Hudson said was exactly what was in David Graeber's book. I had just forgotten the part where it says, most money lending in the Middle Ages was not really done by the Jews. But there is an anti-Semitic trope where, like, just because banking is a somewhat iffy and suspicious profession, there's like attempts to lump, Jewish people in with that. So there is definitely a horrific anti-Semitic trope. So that is true. Now, and it's also true that majority of bankers, maybe there weren't a lot of bankers, and maybe not even the majority of them were Jewish people. I think that's the case here.
Well, what was the exact nature of your question again?
I was asking him that, like, was it Jewish participation in the banking profession during the Middle Ages that gives rise to a lot of this anti-Semitism that we see today? And his response was basically, well, you're getting really the anti-Semitism came first, and then the banking versus the banking, then the anti-Semitism. That was kind of how I understood it.
I guess we've had this idea that Jewish scripture does not prohibit money lending, whereas at least Islam explicitly does, and I guess Christianity probably does too.
Judaism does forbid money lending, but they have these exceptions. You see, It's interesting. They have a bunch. It's all worked out in Judaism. I forgot the name. There's some famous rabbi or something who worked out an exception where Jewish folks could lend money to non-Jewish people. Right, that was the exception, so that's how they could, the church banned it after the fall of Rome. So it was like, well, that's how they could find themselves maybe disproportionately. This was my contention when I was asking the good doctor. It's like, oh, is this the source of? Is it the fact that Jewish people their religion allowed them to loan money, kind of, whereas Christianity and Islam forbade it? And then the other part is they were usually banned from owning regular property due to anti-Semitism, right? If you can't own like real estate, well, money lending is kind of a good way to make money. It's a lot of times Jewish people found themselves in professions like law or other professions that weren't owning property because they were like banned for anti-Semitic reasons.
Well, so is Graeber tiptoeing around some kind of some flack, or is he just speaking the truth with regards to the amount of banking done by Jewish people?
Good question. Maybe I'll bring the passage in next week and read it, and we can all judge for ourselves.
Well, maybe he's just, saying the truth. And
in these passages, he does bring up Shylock, the character from Merchant of Venice, Master Shakespeare's Merchant of Venice. In that story, the idea is Antonio the Venetian falls into debt to Shylock the Jew, but he can't pay. It's unpayable. He can't pay the debt, and the default conditions are a pound of his living flesh. Right, this is a grisly story, and the story is funny. It's all about how Shylock the Jew gets ripped off and doesn't get to collect his debt. Hilarious, right? It's like that's the more or less the plot of Merchant of Venice. And so the Graeber's connection was like the molars pulled out of Jewish people's mouths and the skin pulled off their body to try to get them to forgive the debts that when people fell into debt to them, the Shakespeare represented it the other way. It's like the Jews are the one demanding the pounds of flesh, but really, it was the Gentiles demanding the pounds of flesh. Off the Jews. His point was there's some kind of a guilty conscience or a flipping around of the real true story, or you can see how it was like a real story that then got garbled in a way that made Jewish people look bad and Gentile people look good, when the real story is exactly the opposite.
Well, okay, aren't we suggesting then that it's kind of not like Roger then? If it's true that it was like the Jews getting their molars removed and flesh taken off with scorching tongs or whatever, then that would not be like Roger, eh?
Yes, but the fact that Hudson is so weary from getting hit with the same flack that Roger's getting, that's the connection. It's like what's happening to Hudson, what's happening to Roger. It's like that's what I'm making the comparison here, right? And it's like Roger's criticizing foreign policy, and Hudson is criticizing the way the debt is handled or dealt with or managed, and both of them are getting slapped with the anti-Semitism label, or running into the problem of, in Hudson's case, running into the problem of publications who don't want to go down that road. Where Roger just does his concerts anyway, and he doesn't mind, I guess, playing his Pink Floyd music with a big billboard out front denouncing him as an anti-Semite, and more power to him. He shouldn't care about the immune response to the flack he's getting. But that's the comparison I'm making here. Like criticizing is the Israeli government and criticizing international banking gets you the same flack.
Well, you were saying before how you hadn't heard about any, people on the internet, trying to use banking as some kind of anti-Semitic rallying cry.
Yes.
And I don't know. I guess I haven't. Well, I guess I'm really not in the right circles because, you spend all your time researching this matter. But I guess I don't really know who these people might be that would be like lobbing criticisms at Dr. Michael Hudson.
Well, it's like when you want to get a story. We're going to hear a few clips from Richard Werner's recent appearance on Tucker later, which we talked about last week. But he has stories about trying to get books published talking about how banks actually work, and having the banks get the bank managers initially, the book publishers, initially are very excited about his book, and then they get a call later saying, "Oh yeah, we're not going to be able to publish this. Sorry." And you hear that exact same story about people publishing things that are critical of the Israeli government and the way they're running their politics. You hear about like the lower level editors are excited to run your story, and then then it gets killed from someone from above kills it. At some point. That's usually how. That's a story I've heard over and over and over again from the sorts of experts who pop up on the podcast circuit.
Well, it's going to be advantageous if you're in the money lending business to keep the reality of compound interest on the DL as much as possible. That's the down low.
Yes.
So that part's understandable, and I guess I can see how that can be made into some kind of anti-Semitic trope, and so I guess that makes sense.
The class structure is built on a flim-flam. The class structures of all of history are built on flim-flams, and banking is one of them. And so you have to keep the flim-flam on the down low, like you're saying on the DL. That's always been the case. And we'll get into that much more in the second half of the show here with Richard Werner, who is going to talk more about the secrets, the great secret of banking. I just have one more, again, like half-baked idea here, Brian. I wanted to try this out on you. I spent a lot of time listening to, like two of the best podcasts. One podcast is Tucker, who we're going to hear from later. And like, I still don't know how much I can trust Tucker, but his selection of guests is, since he left Fox News, unparalleled as far as I'm concerned. And then the other podcast we've heard a lot of is Dave Smith's podcast. And I like Smith. I trust him much more than I do Tucker. But he invites on, the intelligentsia from the Libertarian Party, the U.S. Libertarian Party. So I find myself listening to a lot of this, like, sort of libertarian kind of theory or whatever. And I just had one thought listening to that. I guess it's good to listen to media from people who disagree with you politically, like from the other side of the aisle, And so one thought I had was just this: like, it does, like, the emphasis in libertarianism is like freedom, like voluntary contracts, and that's why they value the market. But I don't know. I come from an accounting background, and to me, freedom is like if you have a situation where the labor market is depressed, where there's not enough jobs and too many people chasing those jobs, and people are desperate enough to take jobs at very low wages. The fact that that's a voluntary contract, I don't know. To my mind, I want to match up like revenues and expenses. Like if your neighbor starts a fire and the smoke damages the vinyl siding on your house, right? It's not freedom that's the issue here. The issue is like, how are we going to get the person who has damaged your house to pay for it? You need some kind of an enforcement apparatus to make that happen, right? So, in other words, the person who does the screw up pays for the screw up, right? Matching up revenues and expenses. And it's the same with minimum wage. Like if the labor market is such that people are willing to accept a wage that won't even allow them to pay rent for a month, well, that's not a situation with a lot of freedom, and that's not a maximization of freedom in my mind. Like if your teenager goes to work at McDonald's and McDonald's compensates that teenager like less than it costs to clothe and feed and house them, then you are essentially subsidizing McDonald's bottom line because you think it's a good idea for your kid to learn a work ethic or something like that, or they don't really, they might be willing to accept a minimum wage because someone else covers their room and board, their parents, but yeah, to my mind, the more important thing is to match up the debits and credits so that McDonald's doesn't get a free ride or a free lunch. There's going to be a whole range of salaries where it's profitable for them to hire your teenager, and I don't know, to my mind, it makes more sense to have an authority that makes sure everyone's debits and credits are matched up, because the absence of such an authority inevitably leads to abuses where debits and credits are not matched up. Revenues and expenses are not matched up. So, like I say, that is a half-baked idea. It's just what's been a rattle around the old brain case since we last spun in this pod, Brian.
Well, so the idea is that, because adults, we're subsidizing these companies because their jobs don't pay for, the cost to live, basically, when you consider the cost of apartments and whatnot.
Exactly so. The fact that a person might be desperate enough to accept a low wage, it's not exactly freedom in my view. Like I think that companies ought to at least be compelled to pay for the resources that they consume to run their business. And if you buy lumber, if you're a chair maker or a table maker, and you buy lumber as a business input, you don't buy the lumber with reference to how much the lumber is worth to your business. Right? That you have to buy lumber with respect to whatever it costs in the in the market. Whatever it costs to provide that lumber to your business, you're going to have to, whoever provided the lumber to your business, you're going to have to recoup them for that effort, or they're just going to not do it anymore. And I just feel like labor should be the same. We have you wouldn't want a situation where like the market for it's like if there's a ton of lumber on the market and the price for lumber goes down, that's great, but with what work is a little different in the case that in the workers turn around and then patronize other businesses with the wage that you give them. So we can't. It's an economic disaster to allow business owners to abscond with unpaid wages versus letting them be paid out to workers. So as you can tell, this is all very half baked. But we're going to get into the weeds with debits and credits a little bit in the second half here. And so debits and credits and revenues and expenses, like I say, have been rattling around the old brain case. So we can leave it at that, Brian, unless you've got any more objections or thoughts. What do you say?
I guess we can leave it there.
All right. Well, I suggest to you we take the shortest of breaks, and then we'll come back and we'll hear from Dr. Richard Werner on the secrets of banking. So we will be right back. And we're back. Okay, Brian. So you come from an insurance background, and I come from an accounting background. This is because I come from an accounting background. Last week's episode with Richard Werner on Tucker Carlson, which I had just learned when we spun last week. I was like halfway through this episode and just digesting it. There's 3 clips we just gotta play for the system failure listeners because it is just so perfect. But first, we have to just talk about the difference between assets and liabilities, right? Double entry accounting, invented by the Medici of Florence, in the 15th century. Every single transaction has 2 entries. That's why they call it double entry, right? So, assets are obviously what's the definition I learned in accounting school? I think it's something like probable current or future economic benefit, right? And then a liability is the opposite, something that you owe down the line that you want to recognize. And the way that debits and credits work in accounting is real simple. Assets increase with a debit and they decrease with a credit. And liabilities are the opposite. They increase with a credit and they decrease with a debit. So, if let's suppose you're going to borrow money from me, Brian. I'm the bank. You're going to walk in the door and borrow some money from me. The accounting entry, let's say I'm not a bank. Let's say I'm just me, and I'm going to loan you some money here, right? So what's going to happen when you borrow the money, you're going to do a debit to your asset, cash, right? If you're going to borrow $100 from me, we're going to debit your cash account $100, which is to increase that asset account. So whereas your cash account may have been $0, now I've given you $100. Now that cash account is debited up to $100. Makes sense so far, right? But it's double entry accounting. And the fact that you now owe me $100 has to be reflected on the other side of the ledger, right? So you will also your total journal entry to your general ledger here will be a debit to cash and a credit to a liability account, accounts payable. So your balance sheet would be $100 debit balance to cash and a $100 credit balance to accounts payable, meaning you owe $100 somewhere down the line, and you also have $100 now in your cash account, right? And if I'm me loaning you money, I've got the exact opposite journal entry going on in my general ledger, right? I'm going to credit my cash, right? Now I'm crediting an asset account, so my cash is going down, whereas maybe I had $100 before, I now have $0. But I am debiting an asset account, which means making it go up. That's my accounts receivable, probable future economic benefit. All right, so I have a debit balance in my accounts receivable asset, and I have a credit balance. I've drawn down my cash from 100 to 0. But the point is, I'm transferring between 2 asset accounts when I loan you $100. Right, I am increasing my accounts receivable and decreasing my cash in the exact same amount. Right, so on your end, you're debiting a cash account and crediting a liability, making both those things go up. And on my side, I'm debiting an asset and crediting an asset, so that they wash, right? So the key here, we're going to hear this from Dr. Werner here in a second. The key is that if I'm a bank, the journal entry is going to be exactly the same for you. If you borrow $100 from me and I'm a bank, your journal entry is exactly the same. You're debiting your cash, that is to say, to increase that asset, and you're crediting a liability, accounts payable, because you owe me $100 now, right? Now I'm at a bank. Now I'm also debiting my accounts receivable. You're going to pay me $100, so my AR is now $100, right? But crucially, and this is only banks that can do this, right? They are not drawing down another asset. They are increasing a liability with a credit, client deposit liability, right? If you view it if you can see that, whereas anyone that's loaning money that's not a bank is going to draw down one asset and draw up another asset to balance their journal entry. But if you can see that the bank, rather than balancing two assets, they're balancing an asset and a liability, right? What is the punchline here? That's an accounting way of saying we know that the bank does not make loans. We know that the bank is creating money, not making loans. How do you know that? Because if you put $100 in the bank, right, and then they loan it to someone else, they don't draw down your account. Your debit card will still approve for $100, right? That's how you know. So this whole accounting thing is just another way to say that the banks are creating money. And I think if you can follow that, it's accounting is a bit slippery thinking, but if you can follow that, well, then you can see the secret that lies at the heart of the entire post-Westphalia international order. And I think explaining it that simply is much easier than the way that Dr. Werner explained it on with his explanation. But Brian, if we could, can we dive into clip number 1 here, and we'll hear Dr. Werner build on this point. The banks are not in the business of loaning money. They are in the business of creating money and charging you to access it.
In England, which is the home of banking, the first modern bank was the Bank of England. And in the 17th century, all the banking rules and the laws concerning banking came essentially about in England. And in England, this is therefore most apparent. They call it the client money rule. And there's an equivalent in the US. In every country, there's a slightly different name. But it means that if you have client money, then this money has to be kept off your books. You have to hold it in custody like a custodian, and you have to put it in practice with a bank and say, well, that's the client account. That's not my money. I'm not claiming this. That would be fraudulent, right? You have to be careful. It can be a criminal offense. So everyone has to separate client money from their own funds. And except banks, they're exempted from the client money rule. And that means when we put our money with a bank, it's on the bank balance sheet. And the bank is the keeper of the books. And if you're the keeper of the books, keeper of the records, you can fiddle the records. If you put money of a client into a bank, you can't tell the bank, oh, can you please just be a bit creative with the accounting? It's not going to happen, right? But if you yourself, you're the keeper of the record, you can be slightly creative. So what the bank does is, the loan contract, here's how it works. You're the borrower, I'm the bank, you want a loan, mortgage, anything. And the important thing is the contract that you have to sign, in your own blood. You have to sign it. The loan contract, the agreement, the credit agreement, mortgage, whatever it may be. They're all more or less the same type of instrument. And actually, I should say this, economists classify banks as, they always say this, when they mention banks are financial intermediaries. They're deposit-taking institutions that lend money. But because they're intermediaries only, we don't need to look at this. And then, they take deposits and they lend money. Well, if you look at the legal, situation, it's clear that this is not true. Banks don't take deposits and banks don't lend money. And there's rulings in English courts. What is actually a bank deposit? Well, that is to confuse people. At law, there's no such thing as a bank deposit. It's simply a loan. Well, hang on. A deposit is a loan? Yes. It's a loan we give to the bank. We give credit to the bank when we do what is called deposit our money.
Yes.
And that is the legal status. So it's like the tables are turned. So banks don't take deposits. We lend to them. And the bank deposit at law actually is not privileged. But surely banks lend money? No. Banks are in the business of purchasing securities. And when you sign that loan contract, that's an IOU, a debt instrument that you've issued, and the bank will buy it. That's what's happening. Now,
And can sell it.
well, exactly, you can sell it. And also, you will point out, oh, hang on, fine, these are details. This says, I will get money. I'm borrowing money, so please give me the money. I don't care about the details. And the banker will say, they're careful, they will say, you'll find this in your account with us. They may carelessly say, we've transferred it to your account, which is incorrect, because no transfer happens. Your account will be credited, because the accounts payable liability arising from the loan contract is represented or misrepresented by the bank as another type of liability called customer deposit. And that is the trick you can only do when you're the keeper of the records. And that's only banks that can do that. Others have to keep it off their books, and they can't do this trick of switching the type of liability from, accounts payable liability from the loan contract, present that or misrepresent it as another type of liability called client deposit. That's how money is created. So the conclusion is, when you borrow money, the bank just writes the number in your account. And that's what I could empirically confirm, because at the bank that I finally found, which was happy to do this and let me look inside their books and their transactions and their system, and we had all the bankers there, so we literally were watching what everyone is doing.
Yeah. Okay. So, right there, if you have any sort of accounting 101, if you sat for like accounting class in business school and you just think through it logically, write out your debits and credits, you can instantly see the secret behind the banking system. We think of it as one way, but the reality, we think of it as if they're loaning us money of some hardworking pensioner who made a deposit in their branch, but really they're creating the money out of thin air and charging the rest of us to access that money. Those are the interest payments. And that is the fugazi, or the flim-flam, that lies at the heart of the entire post-Westphalian order of nation-states, and in my estimation. I did have some notes from one of Werner's colleagues, Dr. Rene Menendez. I sent him a few messages just about this interview. I did note where he had a comment on someone else's Substack, just saying that he thought that, he used the word hoax to describe the experiment that Richard Werner just described running at a bank. And the reason that he says that it's empirically invalid is because that bank was never going to honor any transfers into Richard's account. So he clearly, unless he actually takes out the loan and spends, and the bank honors the transfer request to, a payment request against that account, well, that would fundamentally change the kind of accounting they were trying to do. And this is according to Dr. Menendez. And the other note he had was, this whole podcast was designed to lead to the conclusion that central banks were created specifically to fund endless wars. And the opinion I got from Dr. Menendez is just that we're a little bit backwards here. I mean, the Bank of England was created in order to fund an existing war. King William III was fighting across the Channel in France, needed a bunch of money to keep waging that war. So he just feels like the central banks have fallen into, war funding. It didn't start out that way. It started out as a way to fund an existing war versus a bank lending that's looking for international geopolitical conflicts. Okay, so I think we've established, Brian, tell me if you think we've established, the banks do not loan money. They create it out of thin air. We think we can accept that premise and move forward, eh?
It seems straightforward enough.
Yeah, it's a crazy propaganda. It's like a crazy brainwashing job that you have to undo to realize what's really happening to our culture, to our society, to our global civilization. But once you do, you can't unsee it. It's like when astronomers like Galileo discovered that the that the Earth orbits the sun, and that instead of the sun being in orbit around the Earth, right? It's like once you break the illusion, you can't unsee it. Up until that moment, any fool could see the sun moving across the sky. But then once you find out the truth, you realize that the Earth is rotating, the sun's not moving. It's just a different way of looking at the same thing.
Well, I mean, it seems like a sufficient bank run, though, does cause a problem for a bank, though.
That's it. You're exactly right. Yeah. We're getting out ahead of our skis a little bit here, and that is what central banks are supposed to be for, right? To prevent the bank runs by backstopping all the banks that are making these fractional reserve loans, right? Except for Werner's point was during the Great Depression, thousands and thousands, the Federal Reserve let thousands of banks close during the Great Depression. They're not doing their job at all, saving banks. What they're doing is consolidating power with an ever smaller elite cabal of international bankers.
Well, I mean, it sounds to me like, banks do need some amount of deposits to maintain legitimacy. I mean, it's right. This is complex because you got to be careful which words you use. When you say bank deposits, do you mean they need someone to come to their bank and give them money? Yes.
Yeah, they have. A small amount of actual money, actual currency, can give rise. Let's see, a small amount of real currency can give rise to the entire money supply. But that whole money supply is the creation of many, many repetitions of depositing and relending, right? And if you deposit $100 and the bank loans out 90 of those dollars, right, then the next bank is going to loan out 81 of those dollars, so on and so forth. So you get a exponential explosion in the number of dollars through all of this bank credit creation, right? So yes, they need some money, and to your point, when they loan out, and we'll get to more of this because we're going to hear about the goldsmiths, but when if people come and try to withdraw their money, just like what happened to George Bailey in It's a Wonderful Life, right? And there's not enough money in the vault. Well, now you are going to incur the wrath of the community, right? This is where I was thinking anti-Semitic tropes came in during the Middle Ages. I thought people associated banking with with the Jewish community, and I was like, well, maybe banking is what's making it. But that idea seems to have limited historical utility. But you can definitely see why people would become enraged at whoever the bankers are, whether they're the goldsmiths, or the local Jewish moneylender, or the Karasins, or whoever else. You can see where banking would get a bad reputation over time, just like lending money got a horrible reputation after the fall of Rome. Right, similar idea. So I think maybe we should just go into the next clip blind here, because I'm starting to make points that intrude on the next clip. So Brian, if you could fire up clip number 2. Let's hear what Dr. Werner has to say here.
Newton, who's a famous physicist from England, he was very interested in alchemy, and he wrote a lot on alchemy. And then the Bank of England was created, and Newton was very interested in that. Because basically the Bank of England was alchemy at work. You're creating money out of nothing, but not through the actual physical alchemy process. It is the credit creation alchemy. Because banks create money out of nothing, but it's a trick. So what happened is this: when gold is money, and people think we need gold for transactions. One thing was the government's investing in, creating gold, but that was of limited success. Now the reality is, though, that people don't want for their transactions to carry gold around, because it's dangerous. I mean, even today, if you go around New York City, Manhattan, you don't really want to walk around with too much visible gold hanging around you. That's right. It's kind of, in London, you wouldn't want to do it, and that's 21st century. So imagine, 15th, 16th century, 17th century, you don't really want to do that.
Bandits on the roads, no, not a good idea.
So what do? Well, you put your money, your gold, where it's safe. Turns out there's some professions that were working with gold, and therefore they had safe places. They had their own little private security team, private army to watch their safe with the gold. And these are the goldsmiths. They make gold jewelry for the king and the aristocrats and the rich people. And so people started to deposit their gold with the goldsmith. Obviously, you need evidence. Like, what if something happens to the goldsmith and his son taking over the business denies that that's your gold? So clearly you need some receipt. Okay, so that was the convention. They got a little fee for safeguarding the gold. Fine, everyone's happy. But the next step is this. Let's say I'm, in the province, somewhere in Hampshire, in England, and we're neighbors, and we agree I'm buying this plot of land from you, and we agree on the price, and okay, how much gold? Fine. So what are we going to do next? Well, I've got the gold with a goldsmith in London. Okay, I will go and get the gold. By the way, what are you going to do with the gold? Because if you're not going to keep it here, then it's kind of dangerous. Like, I'm risking my life going to get the gold, bring it here, and then you bring it back to the goldsmith. We might as well leave it in the goldsmith, and I give you my deposit receipt. And that's what happens. So the receipts of deposited gold, of deposited money, became the first paper money in Europe.
Gold certificates.
Yes. Exactly. That's how it works. Now,
okay, so we can see here that we are not exactly fractional reserve lending, right? Fractional reserve lending would be as if the goldsmiths were giving out gold bars but keeping 10% of their gold in their vaults, right? So this is another level above fractional reserve lending. We are trading the deposit receipts for the gold and creating the first Europe's first paper currency from that, right? That's what he's saying here. Which you can just see how paper money comes into being from fractional reserve lending, and then the next step after that is central banking, which of course we all know the first central bank, 1694, Bank of England. There was the Reichsbank in Stockholm, doesn't exist anymore, but it was kind of the first version of this. But the oldest surviving central bank is the Bank of England from 1694. No, by the way, it's only in 1717 you have the first Freemason lodge open their doors in London. A lot of the first the men who created the Bank of England were also Freemasons at the same time. So now you're really starting to get into secrets and secret societies and things of that nature. Let's see. I think what we should do, Brian, is run clip number 3 here, and then we'll react to clips numbers 2 and 3 together.
So the goldsmiths, of course, realized what's happening. Oh, nobody's coming to pick up the gold. That's kind of convenient. And this already explains the secrecy that suddenly then engulfed the whole thing. Because people also realize, well, the goldsmiths have the money, they have the gold. And if you get into trouble or you lose your job, you need money. Where do you go? Well, the goldsmiths have money. So people came there begging for money and asking for loans. Here's where the secrecy comes in. Until around 350 years ago, in almost all European countries, it was illegal to lend at interest.
Of course.
That's Christianity. Christian rules. The Bible was against interest, and interest was everywhere forbidden. So the goldsmiths would say, oh, well, yeah, maybe I can lend you some money, but we have to keep this very secret. Because, of course I'm going to charge you interest. Yeah, I'll pay interest. Yeah, we'll keep it secret. And this is what happened. Now, so the goldsmiths realized we can lend out this gold that everyone is depositing with us. Some of it, particularly the one that's like bullion in a standardized size and whatever, we can lend out, nobody will realize. We keep it secret. Everyone's sworn to secrecy because, we're doing something illegal here with the interest. We're charging interest. That's, by the way, how the bond market was created, because it's pretending not to charge interest, discount bonds, where you have no coupon. You come and you want to borrow money. Okay, I'll give you 90 and you pay back 100. Which is the bond calculation of that is the interest, really. But anyway, so all these tricks came about because of the prohibition of interest. But the goldsmiths then realized next, well, hang on, maybe we don't even need to lend the gold. And of course, like every guild, any trade association, they were meeting regularly, they were talking shop. And, how do we deal with this issue? Of course, we don't want to lend out too much gold. We might get into trouble. Also, we need to collaborate. If some goldsmith suddenly needs more gold, we have to help each other. Otherwise, everything will come up and we'll all get arrested for lending at interest. So they were sworn to secrecy. And one goldsmith, probably the first one to have this idea, said, well, hang on, guys, I've got an idea. We don't need to lend out gold. I'll show you. So there's always this guy coming every Monday morning. Okay, so let's wait. He's coming probably in 20 minutes. They always want to borrow money. I've turned him down. I'll lend him money to show you. So he comes around, oh, please, dear goldsmith, I need to borrow this money. All right, today I've decided I'll lend it to you. Here's the standard contract, all the small print, the interest. Your daughters will be sold into slavery if you can't repay. It's just standard practice and all that. Small print. Don't worry about it. Yeah, I know. Okay, it's fine. Just one more thing. Before I give you the gold, okay, we said 300 grams of gold. Here it is. I will, you sign there, I sign, and I lend it to you. But I want you to deposit the gold immediately with me. Well, I need the gold. I need the money. Yeah, but you get the deposit receipt and... Oh, yes, of course. Yeah, that's all I need. I need the receipt. Get it? So what happened was the goldsmith, loan contract signed, and the goldsmith buying that loan contract, that's an asset on the balance sheet, hands out the 300 grams of gold. Now you see it. Now you don't. You've deposited it. Here's your deposit receipt. It's all very transparent. And with double entry accounting, which was created for banking, to hide the truth of banking, it looks all very transparent because you can't see the money creation at first sight in double entry accounting. So why is it's all correct? The borrower deposited the money. Didn't you see it? Just deposited it. But it is still fraudulent. It's fraud. And you can prove this because did this person, the borrower, when they walked to the goldsmith, did they have gold with them? No. But they're leaving the goldsmith with a document that confirms they've deposited gold. Well, how did that happen? And also, secondly, if you measure the amount of gold at the goldsmith, did that increase? No. So that's fraud. Now that's also modern banking. That's how it came about historically.
Pretty awesome. Did you catch that, Brian? It's quite a trick of accounting, but it's fascinating to me that alchemy is so intertwined with the history of banking. I mean, I knew that it was intertwined, but I never made the connection. I never put two and two together the way that Dr. Werner has here. Obviously, we all know that the double entry accounting system invented by the Medici of Florence, in the 15th century, and that was a family famously obsessed with alchemy. Was the secret of alchemy not so much transmutation of base metals into gold, but the creation of gold from nothing using these clever double entry accounting system tricks? It's really quite fascinating. My mind also goes back to Friday, October the 13th, 1307. We all know the first Black Friday. You know the story, right, Brian? With when the Pope brought down the hammer on the Knights Templar. Right? What were the Knights Templar became like a proto bank. Right? They were involved in the exact sort of contracts that Werner just outlined there, right? They weren't allowed to charge interest, but you deposit your gold in the Temple Bank on Fleet Street in London. You make your way to Jerusalem for the Crusades. When you get to Jerusalem, right, you can then trade your letter of credit that the Knights Templar gave you in London at the Temple Bank at the Knights Temple in Jerusalem. You can trade it for gold again, but they might give you 90% or 95%, right? So you can see how they can work around interest here. And discovering that little trick, right, allowed them to amass such wealth as to threaten King Philip IV of France and Pope Clement V of the Vatican, of Rome. And those two guys, in that instance, the Pope was a man who owed some favors to Philip IV, and Philip IV had fallen hopelessly into debt to the Knights Templar. And so this is that Order 66 or whatever from Star Wars on October the 13th, Friday, October 13th, 1307. All the authorities in Europe unsealed letters from the Pope ordering them to arrest the Knights Templar on the most horrific charges of, perversions and blasphemies. And the only monarch who hesitated was King Edward II of England, who gave the Knights Templar a couple 3-4 month head start. He's like, oh man, the Knights Templar, they're really important they're important contributors, to my political power. I can't imagine they're really blasphemers on this level. He dragged his feet for, 3 or 4 crucial months. And in that time, the Templars in England disappeared underground, joining the medieval stonemasons guilds that were, common to England at that time. And there they continued their underground organization. In 1381, the Great Peasants' Revolt tore England apart. And according to both historian Barbara Tuchman and you can say historian Winston Churchill too, because the man was like a historian in in addition to being a politician. And in his book also he talks about the secret societies living in the English countryside who gave rise to the great peasants' revolt of 1381 when 100,000 enraged peasants marched on London, demanding better wages. And you have to understand this is the aftermath of the Black Death, a time when a third to half the peasants of Europe were moldering in early graves. And because of the labor shortage, the peasantry was demanding higher wages and essentially destroying the old feudal system. And so Parliament, much like Justinian and Diocletian, the Roman emperors before him, passed a law commanding workers to accept the pre-plague wages. Well, all of this created a major economic conflict in England, culminating in the Peasants' Revolt of 1381. Well, after the Peasants' Revolt tears England in two, of course, you get the Protestant Reformation, an even bigger rebellion, that takes place across all of Europe. And when the dust settles on that, you have the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648 that subjugates the Pope to a new international order with international borders. Agents of the Pope not supposed to cross international borders and try to influence the religions of sovereign states anymore. But once the Pope, in other words, was the power above the throne, the power behind the throne, the power above the kings and queens of Christendom. Right? But then that Pope the Pope got demoted from that lofty perch of political advantage. And less than 50 years later, you get the Bank of England popping up. And then 28 years after that, you get the Freemasons popping up also in London. And all of it because, King Edward hesitated to persecute the Knights Templar back in 1307. That just leaves the alchemy tie-in. Isaac Newton wrote more words about alchemy than he did about mathematics and physics combined. I mean, think about that. This man is like a genius mind. He turned in revolutionized the sciences, with multiple earth-shattering discoveries. But his real concern, the thing that he spent most of his time thinking about, was alchemy. Or especially towards the end of his life, he became the what was the title? What was Newton's title? He worked for the Royal Mint. He was like he became the enforcement arm for the Mint, enforcing counterfeiting. He would bust people and get them hanged who were guilty of counterfeiting. That's what Newton was doing later in his life. Today we laugh alchemy off as if it's some silly Renaissance magic, but something is definitely off here. Because it does, and that was what really blew my mind about Werner's podcast last week, was this connection between alchemy and money creation. The histories of magic and of alchemy are intertwined with finance, but I never made that crucial connection. I never put two and two together. It's like the history of like religious artifacts, like the Holy Grail and the Ark of the Covenant. These things pop up at the same time as major inflection points in the history of finance. A good example is the invasion of Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar in 587 BC. Right? Nebuchadnezzar sacks Jerusalem, destroys the first temple, and drags his Jewish captives back to Babylon with him as slaves. A few years later, Darius and the Persians conquer the Neo-Babylonian Empire, return the Jews to their homeland. There they consecrate the second temple. Right? That's the story. But the Ark of the Covenant that was in the first temple vanished at the time of Nebuchadnezzar's invasion, never to be seen again. Maybe it's in Ethiopia. Maybe Nebuchadnezzar carried it back to Babylon with him, but it's lost to history at just the moment when the Jewish captives in Babylon learned about the debt forgiveness practiced by the Babylonian kings of the Bronze Age kings of Mesopotamia, baked it into their own holy Bible, where Jesus would later find it during the twilight of the Roman Empire, right? During the beginning of the Roman Empire, as all of the wealth accumulated during the Republican period unwound itself over the course of a couple centuries. So it's like, wow, okay, so there's the Ark of the Covenant, and then then there's the Holy Grail, the other Indiana Jones artifact right? The Holy Grail is what is whispered to have been found by the Knights Templar inside the remains of the Second Temple, right? That Second Temple gets built upon the return of the Jews from Babylon, and it lasts all the way until 70 AD when the temple is razed by Titus, who would go on to become emperor. He'd become the second Flavian emperor. Right? The western wall of the Second Temple of Solomon, right? It's still there. That's the Wailing Wall that people pray at, and fold up little scrolls of paper and put them in. You know this one, Brian. You've seen the people doing the thing at the Wailing Wall. That is the western wall of the old Second Temple that, it sat empty because they didn't have the Ark of the Covenant anymore, but that's the tie in there. But the Holy Grail found in the same the underneath the temple, the remains of the Temple of Solomon in 1099 during the First Crusade, right? The whispers were that the Knights Templar had found some magical artifact that granted them this supreme wealth or God's favor or something. But really, it's this alchemical creation of money through a banking fugazi, right? That's what the Knights Templar were doing, how they amassed all their wealth. And that secret lived on underground in the British Isles, right? Do you know Roslyn Chapel, Brian? It's this chapel 30 miles south of Edinburgh, right? The consortium of bankers who started the Bank of England were from Edinburgh and from London, respectively. And there's this chapel, Roslyn Chapel, which has all of the Templar and Mason imagery, a lot of like the apprentice column. There's a lot of features copied from the Temple of Solomon in Jerusalem, right? And then the other weird bit is that the Roslyn Chapel, it lies on the exact same longitude line as Glastonbury Abbey. And Glastonbury Abbey is the fabled mythical resting place of King Arthur and Guinevere. It was also the place supposedly visited by Joseph of Arimathea. You've heard this name before, Brian? Joseph of Arimathea. He was the guy who owned the piece of land that had the tomb in it that Jesus was buried in after the crucifixion. He was the man that supposedly caught the cup of Christ, the blood of Christ with a cup used at the Last Supper, right? And he shows up in England at Glastonbury, according to legend, with a staff that sprouts flowers, right? To this day, twice a year, one of those dates being at Christmas, they still cut a sprig of Glastonbury hawthorn, right, a flower, and send it to the British monarch in celebration of this legend. And the tie-in here is that the contents, what Brian is supposed to be in the Ark of the Covenant, you remember?
I don't.
It's the shattered remains of the Ten Commandments, the actual stones, carried by Moses on Mount Sinai when he received God's revelation. The actual Ten Commandments. And the other thing that was supposed to be contained inside the Ark of the Covenant is the staff of Aaron, Moses' brother, right? This is the staff Aaron throws on the ground in Exodus, and it turns into a snake. Later, I think is it in Numbers? I think it's in Numbers that Aaron's staff, flowers, just like the supposed staff of Joseph of Arimathea. So there are all these weird old legends surrounding this sort of secret, it's something about finance gets approximated with these weird holy relics, or maybe that's just how people understood what was happening at the time. But whatever the case may be, the final tie-in here, of course, is that the Medici of Florence, as mentioned, were the ones who invented the double entry accounting system, and were also devoted alchemists. So I'm wondering, Richard's, podcast makes me think, wow, what if the double entry accounting system all this time is the alchemical secret? It's been sitting there right in front of our faces. I studied it in school. What if that really is what's meant by what's meant by alchemy? And our version of alchemy that we understand now, the silly, turning, lead into gold or whatever, maybe that's just a caricature to cover up what's been going on historically since that Treaty of Westphalen cleared the way for a new power structure over and above the nominal heads of state. We got the Bank of England and the banking class as our new rulers, and I think that is where these international directives, the COVID directives, the Build Back Better, we got to put IDs on everyone's porn websites. I think that's what's going on here, and so I'm just really excited that Dr. Richard Wagner, the famous anti-Semitic composer of the Ring Cycle, Hitler's famous composer, Richard Werner, the prominent economist who we just heard from, really tied a lot of loose ends together there. So I was amazed and overwhelmed by this podcast. Had a great time listening to it. It's really interesting. Like, history is something else, especially the history of finance, when you dig down into it.
Well, the alchemy, I mean, I'm sure it was a big deal at the time to, realize wealth in the present based off future loans.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I see that. I really think you're cutting to the core of what's happening here. That comment is perfect. Why? It's like humans naturally, we store value for the future. We're like squirrels. That's what we do. You have kids and then you try to, you try to provide for those kids as best as possible so they can provide for their kids and what have you. It's like what is virtuous, what feels virtuous to humans is like saving for the future, and not our future, but the future of our descendants. Maybe that's your kids, maybe it's your community, whatever the thing is. And it's like the opposite of that, stealing money from the future, right, is like an abomination, or it's like it's unsustainable, right? Stealing money from the future. It's you have to be very careful how you allow that to happen, and so it's like it really is like it ties back to that illusion of ego, right? If you think of yourself as a series of people, then that has consequences in how you manage your finances, right? You'll be managing your finances with respect to future generations. But if you're just trying to, if your ego is inflamed and calcified, you'll try to pile up wealth in the here and now at the expense of future people who may not even be here yet, or maybe you don't even care whose expense you're drawing money from the future at. So it's like, well, I mentioned the Holy Grail, right? The Holy Grail has oft been a symbol for the sacred feminine, right? This idea, the idea that you are not really you, has always been characterized as feminine. Why? Because women are the one who gives birth, right? Their bodies fork into two bodies. Like the intuition that you are not really you and that the ego is an illusion has always been given this feminine idea ever since the days of Eleusis, where they worshipped the grain goddess Demeter at Eleusis, just 14 miles outside of Athens, right? Since time immemorial, that intuition that the ego is an illusion has been characterized as feminine, and that's why that's where now we're into the Da Vinci Code territory, where the Holy Grail, as the chalice that held the bloodline of Christ, right? The Holy Grail conspiracy was that the Holy Grail was the person, Mary Magdalene was Jesus' wife Mary, right? The physical, she was the physical vessel that held the bloodline of Jesus Christ, not the cup that was filled with blood at the crucifixion, but the idea in the Da Vinci Code is that she absconded to the presence of Jesus' bloodline threatened the church fathers, right? And so Jesus' wife had to be shuttled out of the Levant into France under the Merovingian dynasty. Is the story in the Da Vinci Code, but you can just see where femininity ties into this. And so, I guess the last great bow to put on this present here, right? One of the big aha moments that I ever had traveling was going to the Medici Palace in Florence, right? And going to their alchemical hedge maze out that they built out behind their palace. And having just come from Eleusis, where they once worshipped Demeter, my mind and the mind of the lovely Tracy was blown to discover that the Medici, the double entry accounting people who were obsessed with alchemy, had used statues of Demeter as the start and finish to their hedge maze labyrinth, with which they used to sculpt, a 3D manifestation or representation of the alchemical journey. So it's wild. Like the Medici are just one hell of a historical crossroads with the references to Demeter and Eleusis, with alchemy, and with double entry accounting. I mean, it is just the layers, the coincidences. I mean, I'm really starting to feel like one of these investigators on one of these crime dramas, where you have a big, all kinds of maps and things on the wall with pins in them and yarn leading to this one and that one, or one of these crazy conspiracy theorists. But there are just so many coincidences here. I'm worried I even may have missed one, but I think we got them all out there for this episode of the old System Failure Podcast, Brian.
All right.
Yeah, okay. Well, I am quite spent after disgorging all of that information, so I will now exhort all of our listeners to come and visit us over at systemfailure.org. There, you can read the weekly essays written by yours truly on the matters of intrigue, like the ones you just heard. You can enter in your email address and sign up to receive those emails in your inbox each and every week. That way, you'll never have to worry about missing one. Furthermore, you can get in contact with either Brian or myself by visiting the About page and clicking on the appropriate name. All right. Well, that does it for another exciting edition of the System Failure Podcast, folks. Have a beautiful week for yourself. Take care.
All right, see ya.